Hi, thanks for coming. Before I begin, I just want to say how much I appreciate having this opportunity to talk with you, and I especially want to thank Laura Kina for inviting me here tonight. It's great to be back in Chicago. I lived here from 2001 till 2007. I went to graduate school here, and my time in Chicago was formative in my development as an artist. I still have friends and mentors here, some of whom are here among us tonight. For those of you who know me and know my work, you know that my multi-ethnic heritage is central to the story that I tell about myself. It has shaped my understanding of the world, and it's one of the primary positions from which I make art. The organizing principle of the War Baby Love Child show is an exhibition of works by mixed Asian American artists. Laura and Wei Ming have constructed the show around both academic frameworks as well as personal narratives, and this provides a platform for me to share with you how my own experience as a person of color and as ethnically mixed intersects with how I make art. Taking this as an opportunity to give you greater insight and context for viewing my work, I'm going to start by telling you more about my background. For those of you who know my artwork, you know that I use an unusual compound word as a name for my work. I'm going to talk about my use of the word automythography and talk more in depth about how I use automythography as a strategy for making work. I'll talk for about 20 minutes before I really get into discussing individual artworks, but I'll continue to project some of my images in order to provide a visual context. One of the things that struck me when I read War Baby Love Child, the catalog for the show, was the centrality of language. There are so many terms to name people of color: words of geography, nation, skin color, ancestry, and history. War Baby and Love Child as starting examples. Some words are pan-ethnic, broad and inclusive, like the word black. Terms range from the serious to the ridiculous: Blasian, Blindian. In creative wordplay, terms are strung together: mixed Asian, African, Black, Desi. Terms are then pulled apart for analysis and interpretation, and as old ones become outdated or inadequate, they are replaced by new ones. Some of the terms cited in War Baby Love Child are Hapa, Eurasian, Amerasian, hybrid, and the mixed Asian body. All of these terms, while often used as self-identifiers, suggest a kind of social space or identification with a community. And while I don't always claim particular affiliations, I recognize the power of naming and framing your position. I'm Black, I'm a woman, I'm South Asian American, I'm African American, I'm heterosexual, I'm Indian. My mother is African American. She grew up in Cincinnati, and my father is Indian. He grew up in New Delhi. My mother was raised Catholic and my father Hindu, but neither claim much, if any, religious belief or affiliation. My dad came to the US in his early 20s for graduate school and met my mother at the University of Cincinnati, and they've been married for 43 years. Next month is their anniversary. Growing up, I was in a school environment of white, upper middle class classmates. Probably the most culturally explicit aspect of my school-based social life was attending my classmates' bar and bat mitzvahs. At home, my family socialized almost exclusively with a tight-knit Indian community comprised mostly of first-generation Indian immigrants and their children. To my sister and myself, the mothers and fathers within this group are all auntie and uncle, and many of the young people are essentially cousins. And yet, even in this metaphoric extended family, I find myself to be a marginal insider. I grew up disconnected from any sense of belonging to a Black community. As an adult, I consciously inserted myself into Black social spaces and artistic circles, falling into and out of these communities as I moved repeatedly and as I continued to experience my perennial lack of fit. I have explained this consistent lack of fit to myself and to others in so many different ways, that the historic one-drop process of US Black racialization, as well as the post-civil rights value of Black solidarity, come together even now to make Black in the US a totalizing identity. So much so that to be Black and to claim any other ethnic identity is often felt as a betrayal. That India's own obsession with skin color and the ascribing of status by gradations of lightness forms a basis for anti-Black racism that is furthered by sentiments of Indian exceptionalism and stereotypes of the model minority that pit Asian immigrants against Black Americans. I've explained my lack of fit by way of language, that I neither code switch nor speak Hindi. Coupled with my culturally complex experience and relevant to my art, but from a totally different framework of identification, is that I'm also an introvert. I think of myself as living and interacting with the world from the position of introversion. This means a lot of different things to me. It means both that I tend to have strong one-on-one bonds and weak group bonds, and it means perhaps most fundamentally that I process the world explicitly through internal reflection and via my personal experience. Perhaps my persistent lack of fit is a joint function of my introversion and my cultural in-betweenness. When I was younger and envisioned what it might be like to be an artist, I never anticipated that my work might provide a solution, that it might help me to find and forge a greater sense of belonging. What I have found, though, time and again, this exhibition being one strong example, is that my work brings me access to and in dialogue with people and communities on my own terms. For the past several years, as my work has cohered around central ideas of both form and content, I have used the term automythography to name my practice and production as an artist. I found this naming to be an incredibly powerful tool. Automythography encompasses my position of being both ethnically mixed and introverted. My use of automythography has developed organically, growing from a word to a strategy and coming over time to define my process of artistic production. In my early 20s, I read Audre Lorde's 1982 book titled Zami, A New Spelling of My Name, a book she termed a biomythography. In her biomythography, Zami, Lorde diverges from and adds to the literary tradition of the memoir. Lorde was a child of Caribbean immigrants. She describes herself as a Black lesbian mother, warrior, poet. Lorde's form of biography includes additions of fiction, poetry, and an expansive notion of telling one's story. It includes the interweaving of myths and stories from one's cultural heritage within the telling of events from one's life. When I read Zami, I think I identified with the intense mother-daughter relational self described in the book. I also related to Lorde feeling both connected and foreign to her parents' nation of origin, how the language, foods, objects, and customs of that other place were ever present in her home environment, and how it created a kind of longing. I've felt that same way in relation to India. These commonalities were my way into Lorde's narrative, but what her story offered me, perhaps most importantly at the time, was a window into a culturally Black experience, an experience that I hadn't known, but for which I had also longed. And perhaps because of Lorde's identity as queer and my ethnically mixed identity, I felt a parallel outsiderness between us. A testament to Lorde's poetic prose, I remember it feeling like she was telling her story directly to me. It wasn't until years after reading Lorde's book that I began using a version of her word as my own. Automythography is a strategy I use to counter limiting frameworks. It is an expansive and inclusive process of self-construction and self-representation, a creative form through which I gain and enact my agency. While in my daily life I am subject to people's assumptions or expectations of me, within automythography I can shape my own story. I can tell the truth via metaphor, and I can create a culturally inscribed environment in which my subject belongs. Automythography is both my conceptual frame and my artistic process. With the materials I use, the imagery I depict, and the methods of how I construct my works, I practice automythography. And in order to show how I realize the aspects of automythography in my work, I'll use a recent series as an example. I'll go through the different stages of the work and relate them back to automythography. I'll start with my source material. When I have an idea for a piece, I typically start by thinking about what gesture or action I need for the figure. In order to establish this, I begin with what I've come to think of as solo performances in front of the camera. I fashion myself through dress, gesture, and expression. As I attempt to embody the posture or action that I'm looking for, I go through several iterations of taking pictures and reviewing images. Since I'm controlling the camera from in front of the lens, there is often a difference between what I think I'm doing and what the photo reveals. I stretch the space, allowing for play in front of the camera. I take a lot of photos, and this is just one example. I see this initial stage as the biographical component of automythography. Whether I stay faithful to the source material as the work develops, or exaggerate, simplify, or stylize the figure, this stage of photographing myself introduces my body into the work. To whatever extent I diverge from naturalism or likeness, the figures in my works are always self-portraits. Once I have created this source material, I make preliminary sketches of the environment my figure will inhabit. It is in this preliminary drawing process that I'm able to introduce the more fantastic elements of my work. While I may establish the body posture of carrying weight by holding a stack of books, it's in the drawing stage that I can make my subject carry a house or the body of her own defeated self. The image that you're seeing is the final work of the recent triptych. This is the first, this is the second, and again, this is the final work. I'm gonna go back to this, so. I refer to this work as collage drawings. The collage drawing process is pretty new for me. I've been making these works for about 1.5 years. As is shown in this sketch, I begin by printing and marking my paper. The paper is just a plain white cotton architect's vellum. I use a variety of tools for this initial stage. In the drawing here, I'm using one of my main tools, which are Indian textile printing blocks. Carved printing blocks have been used in India since at least 900 AD. Their patterns often echo patterns in architecture and stonework, and as an example of early hybrid aesthetics, their patterns changed and developed through trade and cultural exchange. Similar printing blocks were used in Europe and eventually in the US for the printing of wallpaper, and I use some of those as well. I use old letterpress type and other kinds of stamps and mark-making tools. I print on relatively small sheets. I then rip these apart and collage them together to build a page. The image here is an example of the collaged paper before I begin the drawing. What I'm starting with then is a cultural ground. The surface is textured with fragments of pattern, color, and marks to form a kind of paper quilt that integrates elements across time and across geography. In my drawing stage then, I'm merging my imagery with this surface, trying to reconcile the figure with the ground such that the two are knitted together, creating an integrated whole. It is through this whole process, the solo performances in front of the camera, the preliminary drawing, and the construction of the culturally inscribed ground that I enact automythography. This triptych is the most autobiographical work I've made. In it, I depict my recent move. I move a lot. In the past 7 years, I've lived in Chicago, New York, Houston, and now Baltimore. So this triptych is an example of my use of automythography in practice. It combines self-portraiture with an expansive, imaginative space that includes fantastic elements derived from both my cultural lineage and my daily life. Beyond my own artistic strategy, I see automythography as a wider proposition for the importance of self-definitions, a framework wherein individuals gain and enact their agency, in both their self-construction and their representation. To quote Audre Lorde, "If I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive." I'm now going to move on to talking about individual works. I'll start with the works in the War Baby Love Child exhibit. Later in the talk, I will show works starting in 2005 and work my way to the present, jumping around a bit in time. Eventually, I'll also come back to this triptych and talk some more about that series. Even though some of the materials and methods I described in this work are not the same as the materials and methods of all of my work, I hope that using this as an example provided you with an understanding of automythography that you can then apply to the rest of the work. The works that I will show vary in size, but I generally work large. So please take note of the dimensions listed on the slides so you have a sense of the scale of the work. Coming to give this talk is a kind of double return to me, a return to Chicago and a return to an earlier body of work from which the two works in the show are examples. From 2007 through 2009, I did a series of works in which there were two central devices: inversion of the head and exaggeration of the hair. The inversion of the head was to disorient the viewer's relationship to portraiture and to signal a shift from the real to the imagined, from the biographical to the automythic. This piece, Dream Region, is actually a remake of a piece titled Night Emissions. Night Emissions was a work I made while in collaboration with 8 teenagers and with Iga, who's here in the audience tonight. Great to have you here. I was working with a program called Blue Sky Project. We worked literally on top of each other, and this pile of people resulted in a visual mix. To my surprise and absolute delight, this piece was purchased by one of Chicago's artistic greats, visual artist Nick Cave. Upon hearing about the sale, I started imagining what the piece must have looked like for him. In making Dream Region, I tried to amplify the aspects of Night Emissions that I saw related to the mix of adornment, visual rhythm, and pattern that's a feature of Cave's work. This piece was originally going to be in the show, but for logistical reasons, it couldn't be included. But Laura and Wei Ming wrote about the piece in chapter 1 of the exhibition catalog, and I appreciate what they had to say, so I'm just going to read their description of the piece. In her 2009 drawing Spark, Ahuja focuses on the constructed nature of her self-representation. The camera shutter release cable is clearly visible in her hand, and as she presents a mirrored self-portrait, bowing deeply, arms thrust out, the sleeves of her Indian kameez open like bird wings. As her head swings down, she unleashes a mass of loose, curly, good hair. At the point in the drawing in which her double afro unites, a psychic explosion ignites. With uncontained hair and wearing a salwar kameez, Ahuja simultaneously signals Black power and Indian ethnicity. Nonetheless, the artist's refusal to face the viewer, evident in closed eyes and downturned head, forces Spark's audience to move from an easy reading of ascribed identity to focus on less tangible modes of mind and energy. As Ahuja summarizes, the flow from the head becomes a flow from the mind, a vehicle of infinite possibility. And I think a lot of what is said about Spark could also be said about this piece, Loop. These are more pieces from the hair-themed work. The exaggeration of the hair is a response to the history of Black hair as a barometer of social and personal consciousness. I thought about hair as having both physical and conceptual relevance, and I represented the hair in its psychic proportions. I used a simple process for making this work, using the texture of the paper to build the massive hair through simple, small, repeated marks. This building of form through small marks is an ever-present and ongoing interest of mine. And here you can see a detail. And this was also part of the Tress series. This wasn't part of that same series, but it has similar elements. This was a work on canvas from that period. I made all of those works while I was living in Houston, where I did a 2-year residency at the CORE program. The CORE program is a program of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and this piece was installed in a show, included in a show at the museum, and they used it for the banner, which was pretty cool. And the painting is now in the collection of the Blanton Museum in Austin, Texas. I also made this work while I was at the CORE program. It's in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. It was kind of my culminating piece. Oh, actually, I made this one also while I was at the CORE program. I stayed in Houston for 3 years, and I moved to New York in 2009 as an artist in residence at the Studio Museum in Harlem. At the Studio Museum in Harlem, each artist is given a studio space overlooking 125th Street, and you have around eight months to make work for a final group show. When I was getting ready for that residency, I knew that I wanted to move on from the hair imagery. And as a way to get new ideas, I started thinking about works that I'd made back when I was in Chicago. In order to take you through that process, I'm going to jump back in time here and talk about some of what I made in Chicago. So in 2005, I had an exhibition at the MCA curated by Tricia Van Eck. It was a small show, one of the exhibitions the museum was doing at the time for emerging local artists under the title 12 by 12. And it was my first significant professional opportunity as an artist. I had 6 works in the show, but there were 3 works that have continued to occupy my artistic imagination. The work for that show was related to my ongoing interest in a particular series of Victorian children's stories. At the time I painted Boogie Woogie, I saw my figures as stand-ins for myself, as almost self-portraits, and at the same time as stand-ins for the fictional character Mowgli from Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book. I'd read The Jungle Book about a year prior to my 12 by 12 show, after finding it on the discard table at the library. I identified with the character Mowgli and with the struggle he had to fully belong in either the jungle or the village, and it felt like a kind of allegorical parallel to my own experience. I titled the show Dancing on the Hide of Shere Khan, which is a reference to the Jungle Book. Shere Khan is the tiger that Mowgli defeats. The title Boogie Woogie has multiple meanings, one of which is a repetition of this dancing idea. The figure in this piece was based on an image from the Hamzanama, which means the story of Hamza. The Hamzanama is an illustrated manuscript from the Mughal period in India, and it was commissioned by the then teenage Emperor Akbar, at least the version of it that I'm looking at. I have a particular interest in Indian art. While my attraction is part tied to my heritage, my interest includes the different faith traditions, from early Buddhist temple art to Hindu painting traditions, as well as works from the Mughal court that brought together both Islamic and Hindu aesthetics. I'm particularly drawn to works with fantastic creatures and animal subjects. As an outsider with no religious affiliations, my interest in this work is visual, and I feel at liberty to choose the aspects that interest me and to make use of them in my work. The same is also true to my use of Western aesthetic traditions. Woogie Boogie, reversing of the words, was another work in the Dancing on the Hide of Shere Khan exhibit. This piece brings together 2 recurring elements of my work, the figure with a strong forward momentum and a dark landscape. The figure Woogie Boogie was also sourced from the Hamzanama manuscript. And more than any other single artwork, this piece has been a central inspiration for my work. I'm specifically interested in the way the blue spotted demon figure here is powerfully activating the space, and the way the figure is linked to the landscape through mark and color. If you can hold the image of that figure in your mind, you will see my adaptation of it again and again throughout the works I show. The third piece from the Dancing on the Hide of Shere Khan show that continues to have artistic relevance to me is this work, Deepest Darkest. The idea for Deepest Darkest was a landscape at night. I wanted the value difference between elements to be so slight that even though there's actually a lot of color in this piece, that it's perceived of as black. I built up the surface using thickly applied paint and then carved through the paint with a palette knife to distinguish between forms. So, going back, I was telling you about my move from Houston to New York, and approaching that move, I had this piece on my mind. I wanted to get back into the idea of the dark landscape, but also allow for more color and contrast. I made this work just before moving to New York. Here, the surface is built up more slowly with thin and thick applications of paint, allowing for drying time between the layers. This was a piece I made while at the Studio Museum, and it was included in our final exhibition, as was this one. This was in the show, and it's now in the collection of the Studio Museum. And this piece came later, but since it was related to this work, I included it here. Here you can see the works installed. The exhibition was curated by Naomi Beckwith, who is now here in Chicago at the MCA. Naomi connected the works by all three of the artists, myself, Lauren Kelly, and Valerie Pereno, with the concept Unusable Pass, and that was the title of the show. This was another piece in the Studio Museum show, and perhaps you can again see elements of the source material from the Hamzanama. And here you can see it installed. This was another piece from the Studio Museum show. I think of this work as having similar elements to the Dream Region piece in War Baby Love Child, the way the figure is commanding or generating a creative outpouring. Formally, the thing that ties all of these works together, including the hair drawings that I showed earlier, as well as the autocartography triptych, is the building of form through small marks. I'm interested in highly textured surfaces, and by layering paint and distinct marks over time, I create a dense ground. The work of two contemporary artists, Elan Atsui and Mark Bradford, have been instructive to me in thinking about how to use small marks, patches of color, and fragments of pattern to build a surface. When I finished Generator, I initially thought I was done preparing for that show and that this was going to be the final work. But then I started feeling like something was missing. In the final weeks before the show, I began a new series. I was thinking about the figures in the paintings, the figure in Forge, and the figure in Generator. I wanted to make works that revealed a deeper psychological aspect of these characters. I named the new series Dream Sequence after the cinematic idea of a dream sequence. In a movie, a visual consistency is established, and then during a dream sequence, the visual world gets slightly distorted, taking a turn to the surreal. So the dream sequence works are meant to be images from the daydreams, diversions, and fantasies of the subjects in my painting. I ended up exhibiting 3 of these in the Studio Museum show. And the title here, Ka's Hunting, is again a reference to the Jungle Book. Ka is a snake from the book, and one of the stories is called Ka's Hunting. And here's the work installed. And here's one more view, and this image on the far left is this piece. So I spent 2 years in New York living and working in Harlem. Being at the Studio Museum was a dream come true and a truly exhilarating time. I moved to Baltimore in August 2011 when I was invited to be an artist in residence at MICA, the Maryland Institute College of Art. For the academic year, MICA housed me at the Kramer House, a house that was built by the former owner, sculptor Reuben Kramer. He and his wife were artists, and they built the house as a live workspace, and it was, as you can see, an absolute dream studio. So when I moved to Baltimore, I had a scheduled show at the National Portrait Gallery for which I wanted to make new work. That show, which is called Portraiture Now, Drawing on the Edge, is currently on view in DC. It's up through mid-August and then travels in the fall to Arkansas. So when I first got to Baltimore, I was trying to figure out what to make for that show. With the concept of the show being drawing, I knew that the works needed to be works on paper. I made this piece earlier in the summer, just prior to moving to Baltimore. After the dream sequence works I'd made at the Studio Museum, I had continued developing that body of work, and eventually I began adding collage elements, and this is when I first started stamping and marking the paper. This is a detail. I was interested in the dream sequence works, but I felt that I needed to make and show something more for the portrait gallery show, something bigger and something that encompassed aspects of my larger works on canvas. So this was the first collage drawing I made, and it's in the portrait gallery show along with 2 other collage drawings. It was from the minor aspect, collage aspect of the dream sequence works that I came up with the idea to construct the whole page out of the collage process. And again, the work of Mark Bradford was instructive here. This piece, Royal Ease, is an update or a return to the imagery of a piece I showed earlier called Generator, which I'd made at the Studio Museum. You can see that I include in my figures my amblyopia, otherwise known as lazy eye. I was born cross-eyed, and I use only one eye at a time for my central vision, and it's a feature that I like to include in my self-portraits. And even though I use both color and paint on these, I refer to them as drawings. I'm always thinking about what makes a drawing and a painting a painting. Among other differences, for me, drawings are more immediate, both in that they can be made more quickly and that they exhibit an idea very directly with speed and energy. This is another of the collage drawings that's in the portrait gallery show. The title is from my nicknames. My father calls me Moku, and my aunt called me Miku. I like the sound and wordplay of those names, Miku, Moku. With double self-portrait, I was thinking about internal battles one has with oneself, overcoming of something old in order to grow or change. So here, my subject is fighting herself. You can again see the remote shutter control in her hand at the top of the page, a way to signal to the viewer that these are self-portraits and that she is in control of her own depiction. And these pictures are slightly cropped. The actual works have organic edges. These are the art movers. I don't know if maybe you can see kind of the edges here. Eventually, I ended up making another of the winged dream sequence works as a partner to the one I showed earlier. The 2 of them now flank the doorway at the gallery. So you can kind of see them there. And as you enter the gallery, this is the central work. The piece is titled Moku Nama, recalling the 16th century manuscript Hamza Nama, Moku Nama, the story of Moku. In addition to the 2 main figures here, I've inserted smaller images and figures in the work. I'm interested in making a kind of cross-referenced network of images that span my entire body of work. So in addition to the paper that comprises the collage base, I also integrate small enamel drawings from the dream sequence works, as well as colored pencil drawings. And I'm using the word drawing for both these large involved works and for small drawings like the colored pencil works that function more like sketches. I have a bunch of small colored pencil drawings, and because many of them are preliminary drawings for larger works, I think of them as a kind of mirror to my body of work. I've been making these drawings for years. I think of them as preliminary drawings, but also as a body of work in their own right. And again, in this cross-referencing process, sometimes I collage them into larger works. They're each around 14 by 11, and I'm just going to click through a bunch of these. Oops. So again, the collage drawings have some colored pencil drawings and dream sequence works integrated into them. In Moku Nama, for example, on the upper left is a collaged and colored pencil drawing, and layered over the figure at the bottom is a dream sequence work. And there's another one on the right on the tree limb there. And these are the works installed at the National Portrait Gallery. So I showed you this work earlier. These are the more recent collage drawings. A variant from automythography, I use the word autocartography as a title for this series. Autocartography as in mapping the self or making a map for oneself. It's a triptych and the narrative moves from right to left. I showed you an image of my studio at the Kramer House at MICA, and here's another view of that space. So on the upper right here is the Kramer House. I've depicted it in a way reminiscent of a Mughal manuscript painting in which you can see the interior and the exterior of a building at the same time. So what you're seeing here is the building opening up like a kind of a jewel box. And here's a detail of the reclining figure. In some of these I'm also writing. It's another texture in the works, and I'm interested in them not as words but as marks. The writing is mostly illegible, but it's just a stream of consciousness. And this is to give you a sense of the surface. In addition to seeing these works as narratives of my own move, I also see them as embodying a kind of cultural migration. The triptych was inspired by ancient pictures of traveling processions. Here, the trio is traveling at night. Typically, in early pictures of traveling processions, such as in Chinese scrolls, there is a privileged class carried by a servant class. Here, I depict myself in both positions as the carried and as the attendant figures, portraying my subject as self-sufficient. And here is a detail of that central figure. These works were on view this past winter at the Bakersfield Museum of Art in California. And then two of them were in a show in Rockville, Maryland that just ended last week. This was during our installation. So for both the Portrait Gallery show and the Bakersfield show, I needed to focus on works on paper, and I really wanted to get back to working on canvas. I found that working with the paper and the patterning had given me some new approaches to thinking about my imagery and the surface of my works, and I wanted to see if I could integrate the paper elements into the oil paintings. This is a recent painting. It's part of a single series comprised of 5 paintings. The whole series is called Rhyme Sequence, and each piece is then individually titled. And I'm just going to flip through them to start so you can see them all. I'm showing them not in the order that I made them, but rather their order in the series. So Spring Sprung is the first in the series. So again, this is the first work in the series, and you can see that the paper elements are repeated throughout the series, changing from piece to piece. I see the series in part as a kind of visual narrative of that one purple pattern far on the left there, how it's reused and put to new purpose in each work. So Spring Sprung depicts the formation stage of the Rhyme Sequence series. It depicts a kind of drawing state with a simplified version of the setting that is later inhabited by the subject. Here you can see the purplish pattern has become the figure's collar or necklace. The figure here, again, is modeled after the Hamzanama piece. Compared to the barely visible hero in that original image, it's the demon that has all the presence and dynamic in the picture, dynamic action in the picture, and it's after the demon that I've modeled my own subject. So I start these works with a single layer of patterned paper. You might notice here the elements that comprise the tree form in the last piece now make up the bundle or shape near the foot of the figure. So I'm leaving the paper visible in its final surface as forms within the composition. In other places, I'm painting over the paper but retaining the patterns, such as in the body. While my subject is alone in this world, I want it to be evident that there are elements of a culture here and that that culture is inscribed on her body. This is the third piece in the series, again, more abstract and simple like the first. I often use blue to signal a kind of transformational aspect in the figures or in the environment. So here the subject is embodying a transformation. And here's a detail. This is the final work in the series, and you can see that the paper with that purple pattern is now taking central form. So this series rhyme sequence is my most recent body of work. It's probably the work I'm most proud of. It integrates all of my interests in the figure, in narrative, and surface, and texture, and carrying those ideas across 5 large canvases was challenging. I finished this work just a couple months ago. Since completing Rhyme Sequence, I've made these 2 works. The hair imagery is about a kind of self-discovery. As I've described, I grew up in an environment in which other Black people were essentially absent, and I grew up just hating my hair. My sister and I were always wanting to straighten our hair, but our mother was reluctant to let us use harsh chemicals, so we used to spend hours brushing out our hair with hair dryers and straightening irons. I understand now that my environment just didn't give me a context in which I could understand my hair or my looks as attractive. Looks have never been that important to me, and I think I've always had healthy self-esteem. And yet, as an adult, when I put myself into diverse communities, I really went through an internal change. I started receiving this different kind of feedback about myself, and specifically about my hair. I received enough of this positive feedback that it changed the way I felt about myself. So the hair work really embodies both my personal experience as well as a kind of cultural space. I've often found that my creative production is more cyclical than linear. There are different things that can spur a return to an earlier imagery or idea. Over time, I increase my skills and have new thoughts about how to make things, and this can take me back. For this work, it had been a couple of years since I'd used the hair imagery, and I was interested in seeing what I would make if I took it on now. So I just finished these just right before coming out here. In addition to those, I'm also working on preliminary drawings for a new triptych that will be in the form of large collage drawings. This is one of the preliminary drawings. The imagery comes from my neighborhood. Living in Baltimore is strange. The city has deteriorated, and there are pockets that are totally abandoned. Within just a few streets of where I live, there are 2 burned houses that just sit there. They're so burned up and falling apart that you can see the sky through them. And while they are markers of deterioration, they're also visually interesting. And I've been thinking about a triptych that embodies an idea of creation and destruction as a mirror to art making. Art making and art as a tool is at the heart of my use of automythography. Art making for me has always been a productive way to counter limitations I see in myself and in the world. Through automythography as an artistic practice and framework, I gain and enact my agency. Like all of the work I've shown, the new collage drawings will be another example of my use of automythography. It will incorporate material from my daily life. In the stamping and collage stage, I will create a cultural ground and then work with my imagery to knit myself into that environment, merging the actual with the imagined. So this brings you up to date with my work, but before I finish and solicit questions, I just want to restate how much I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to be part of the show. I've really enjoyed reading the War Baby Love Child book, especially the interviews with the other artists. If you haven't already, I encourage you to read them. And thank you again to Laura and Wei Ming for including me among those voices. And I really appreciate you coming out tonight. Thanks. So, any questions? Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for coming.
How long did it take you to do all this stuff?
Thank you. It really depends. I'd say from a week to 3 weeks to 6 to 8 weeks, depending on the scale of the work. Yeah, it just depends on, and often like I really only work on one piece at a time, but very often I'll come back to a work, you know, after working on something else, especially something like the rhyme sequence where one work was kind of building on the next. I would start to figure things out and then could go back into an earlier piece. So that's why it's a little hard to judge, because as long as it's in my studio, I'm always kind of working away on it. So, yeah.
Super interesting work, thank you. I was wondering if you could speak about your contemporary art, I'm going to call it industry, because I see, for example, the hair pieces remind me of some of the work of Lorna Simpson, for example, where she also thought of the hair perhaps in different ways, but there's some connection there. Your interest of working with paper and collaging paper onto paper or the canvas reminding me of Carrie James. And also there's a kind of stylizing of the figure, of your own figure that you do that reminds me a little bit of his figure. So I find that your work aesthetically is also in conversation of aesthetics that are also being established by other artists that have similar interests of yours. So I wanted to see how you see yourself placing that lineage.
Yeah, you stated it perfectly. I'm wearing my Kerry James Marshall t-shirt that he made for the Whitney Biennial show as a kind of shout out to Kerry, who was my advisor at UIC for graduate school, but has continued to be an ongoing mentor to me and is just the most generous teacher. So I would say the single, you know, most influential artist on my work has been Kerry James Marshall. You know, Kerry has a very kind of principles of art making that he passes on, and I think about those ideas all the time in the studio. But you're exactly right. You know, Lorna Simpson. I always draw a blank at this question. Romare Bearden, thinking about collage. I was just in this Bearden show at the Studio Museum in Harlem as a kind of centennial celebration for his work. But I don't, you know, it's hard for me to contextualize myself, like to get a hold of it. I feel like I just look at so much different work across geography, across time, and it all kind of percolates in my head as like usable material, and I just kind of reach for it when I need it. And I talked about El Anatsui, who, you know, his work using these kind of elements of their metal, discarded metal pieces that he finds, and he, you know, is creating this incredible fabric out of it. But I think about his work a lot in terms of how do you build something large out of these really small marks that in and of themselves, these little areas are so rich with color and texture. So I'm always looking at those and details of those, and likewise I mentioned Mark Bradford, and Mark Bradford's work as well, this kind of dense ground that feels deep physically in its layering of material. There's so many more artists, and I'm always asked this question, I always draw a blank. Next time I need to just write it down. Oh,
Yeah, because of the, you know,
yeah, Shazia Sikander, yeah. Yeah.
So I think that the connections that all of you, when wearing other, creates that kind of syncretic mix in your work. Because, you know, Kerry also talks about the influences of the masters in his work, you know, but that syncretism you make it your own, and then he tells you a particular story.
Yeah, other thoughts? Yeah.
I was wondering how deliberate your usage or your drawings mixed in with the block printing collages is. The autocartography series certainly seemed like it was more random. You found space for the drawing on top of it. where the rhyming one was definitely more incorporated into it. So, I mean, I've seen, it looks like both, but
Yeah.
Well, and it's such a new process for me. I mean, I started that collage drawing process 1.5 years ago, so I'm still kind of figuring it out, and certainly still figuring out how it works in oil painting, or can be integrated into a large oil painting. In terms of like, initially, the collage process in and of itself is pretty random. I feel like as I'm working with it, I'm getting more able to kind of know where the imagery is going, so be able to judge where on the page to lay that foundation. But it's such a kind of, I can't put any kind of preliminary drawing on the surface itself because it just gets covered up. So it's a sort of feeling in the dark. And I like that aspect of it. I like that having to kind of make it work as I develop the piece. So, but definitely in the rhyme sequence works, you know, I was deliberate, like trying to, you know, let the form keep taking shape, but it was more leaving opportunity for that in building the initial collage on the canvas. So I might leave, for example, I might know that I want the purple to be part of the collar, but I don't know exactly where the collar is going to be, so I'll leave a whole block there and know that at some point there I can kind of carve out that shape. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
As you continue to make new drawings and new pieces of art, do you feel like you're, I guess, continuously or constantly learning about yourself? And as you talked about this idea of, you know, lack of fit and a sense of belonging, do you feel like you're still kind of learning new things about who you are and where you fit in everything?
I mean, I keep changing, definitely, and I keep changing. But, you know, what's so interesting is having to take this step back and craft a talk around the work. You know, and this platform provided by this show and by Laura's invitation really made me try to take a step out of the studio and organize my thoughts, which is not something that I do that often. And I was often in conversation with my partner, and we were talking about these ideas. And I think it's as much through that kind of sort of putting words to it, trying to articulate it, that I make these discoveries, you know, and it's sort of like the example, you know, at the end that I showed you of those new hair-themed works, really taking that apart and trying to understand where does that come from in me. I hadn't articulated that before this talk, so, yeah. You know, I articulated more naturally the kind of cultural aspect of it, but the personal aspect took me a little longer to get to. So, other thoughts, questions?
I was just wondering if you've seen the Lorraine O'Grady video, Landscape. It's a 20-minute video where it's with these sort of outdoor sounds, you know, crickets and stuff like that, and forests, I suppose. And it's a close-up of her hair being blown. It's the entire 18, 20 minutes.
Great. What is it? Just have a title? I'm just writing it down for my.
Oh, it's called Landscape, and in parentheses, Western Hemisphere. And it debuted in a show that she did at Alexander Gray a couple of years ago, but it was also in Blues for Smoke at the Wiki. Yeah.
Somebody else had their hand. Yeah. In the blue shirt.
Oh, yeah.
I had a question about scale and the size that you're working on. Like your drawings, they feel like complete works to me, and then your paintings are large. What are you thinking about? And like, do you ever think about working in miniatures or raising for the grand size?
Well, I was talking about this earlier with Laura. You know, Carrie always was pressing, he always said work to the limitations of your space. And I've done that with the exception of the Kramer house where, you know, it was this cathedral ceiling. I didn't work to the limitations of that space. But I've worked beyond the limitations of my current home environment, studio home environment, so much so that I couldn't get works recently out. It was this very complicated situation. So I guess I think about, so part of it is that sort of instilled in me earlier on in my formation as an artist to work large. And then part of it is that the works are very physical. Like, you know, when I'm making those collage drawings, I'm on the floor, I'm stamping, it's like really my body is involved. And I try to avoid kind of a close sort of hand orientation to drawing, and I'm more interested in this kind of physical relationship to that space. And my hope is that translates to the viewer, that the viewer's body then, you know, when they're not looking at a slide, but they're actually looking at the work, has this physical relationship to that space. But the colored pencil drawings, I love making those drawings. You know, they're more intimate, they're less physical, but they're pleasurable in a whole different way, so, yeah. Yeah, Laura.
Actually, you're talking, we both, I guess, studied with this artist, Carrie Hughes Marshall, who we keep referring to, but he would always say, don't illustrate something, you gotta embody it.
Right.
And so this project of, you know, editing, writing a book, curating the show, in some ways it's about me wrestling with the problem in the studio.
Right.
And you need to like get out there and just do it, right? If the system isn't what I wanted it to be, figure out how to do it, and do it right, right? And sort of embodying that. And as you're talking about too, the practice, in your studio practice, I'm hearing so many of these things that our former teachers taught us. There was two artists that were kind of, for me, the start of this exhibition. One was Mequitta's work, and the other is Amanda Ross Ho, so another Chicago artist. Two people who I thought, Carrie always talked about making also emphatically black work. So I'm like, well, what does an emphatically mixed work look like? For me, it was about illustrating, I'm half this, half that. It's what is your methodology that's in your studio practice, all these kind of things. What would that look like? And I was really interested in finding out what are artists doing in this sort of post-racial moment where we're supposed to be beyond race, right at the moment when it's exactly when we're discovering that there's over 9 million people who are saying that they're of one or more race in the U.S. What are we supposed to just get over that or not deal with it? How can you make really interesting work? So the two of you were sort of a starting point in that journey to find out, well, how are artists doing this all across the country in this U.S. context? How are they making good work with these type of topics?
I want to let people go if they want to go, but I just want to jump on what you're talking about a little bit and say another thing from Carrie's sort of principles, like that you were saying about don't illustrate the work, embody the work. He always talked about don't use your work to make your images, and this goes back to the last gentleman's question. Don't use your materials to make images in the way that you use your materials. And so really this kind of building toward it and letting the process create and impact the way the final, you know, I don't want to use the word image, but the final piece kind of becomes itself. So I really had to wrap myself around that, and I think about it all the time in the studio. So. Thanks.